So yeah, like I said, this is an outlook on the new frontiers of MCTDH-X, and I'll also give you kind of like a brief promotional poster on who we are, the people involved right now, and so on. So this is the core team as of today, fall 2024. So the main developers are, careful with the cable, yeah. The main developers are me, Elke from Tübingen, Elke Fassauer, and then people from ETH, and Ray used to be at ETH, now he went to then he went to Innsbruck, now he's in China. And then people from University of Haifa, Sunayana, Datta, and Ophir, he's the group leader. Manuel and Lydia work with Elke. Actually, Lydia went to do a PhD with someone else. Rombek works with Ophir. Barnali is India. I kind of collaborate with her. And then Chitra is the group leader at ETH. And of course, Daniel is the new PhD student there. So this is kind of like the core people that are working with it. In Stockholm, apart from me, there is Julia, who you know. Well, she did a project with me. Now she went to do a PhD at KTH with Jens, but she's still kind of involved in the MCTDH-X, and I think she will come in the afternoon to help out with the simulations if needed. Then there is also, I want to acknowledge the past collaborators and co-developers. Axel, who basically developed most of the code from the Heidelberg package, who's now left academia. And then there is many people who were involved through the years at different stages of either the theory or the coding itself.
So Hemmerich and Esslinger, they are experimentalists. So what did they do?
Well, we collaborated with them for some papers.
Okay.
So they were providing
with the cavities.
With the cavities, yeah. Actually, with the Emmerich group, he provided the data to do a full quantitative comparison between our MCTDH-X calculations and then what they were seeing in the experiments for the superfluid to multi-insulator transition in 2D. And then something similar was doing, Tilman was doing in ETH. So we have now a big international network of collaborations that span many different countries and institutions. What we do in terms of activities, of course, we maintain the code. We, try to add more features to it. We use it to do research, obviously, publish papers. We used to have, at least now it's an hiatus, a journal club on quantum physics and machine learning. But I'm in contact with some people in Poland who wants to start something similar. So maybe we'll restart it together. And then in terms of research, there is many different fields that we can use MCTDH-X for. One is fundamental behavior of few particle systems. So, Bose-Einstein condensation and the behavior of BECs under different changes in the environment, time-dependent potentials, and so on. This is one example. Description of AMO physics and AMO experiments in general. Cavity BEC was a very big component in the past 5 to 10 years. Now I'm going personally more into the direction of quantum simulators. Quasi-crystals, I will talk about it in a bit. And also we had 3-4 years ago, we started integrating that with machine learning optimizations. And I think there is also a huge potential of combining machine learning with the way that the equations of motions are solved, or the way that we define the composition itself, maybe combining with this multi-layer structuring. And in general, it's a very good tool to research strongly correlated phenomena because we are able to handle fairly strong interactions, for instance, from dipolar molecules. So in terms of research, I think we can also kind of decide or figure out which systems this is suitable for by combining 4 things. So the potentials that we can describe in the system, the type of interactions, the fact that we can have time dependence, so we can do driving and quenches, and then the fact that we can also add interactions with cavity fields, so with photons. So then anything that can combine these four elements can be simulated efficiently with MCTDH-X. And here I give you some examples. So driven quasicrystals, BCs in cavities that are also driven, cavity-mediated interactions, flow-K dynamics. We also did flow-K dynamics in cavity BC systems. Yeah, and just those are just some examples. You had a question, or you just side? Okay. Now, current research directions, at least from my perspective, I'm interested in 3-4 major ones. One is, like I mentioned, quantum simulation, in particular dipolar quantum simulators. There is a new wave of experiments that are coming about where they're able to really precisely trap either magnetic atoms or like, dysprosium, erbium, or dipolar molecules. And then in principle, near term, they could place those type of systems, molecules, and atoms in optical lattices and then can simulate models that have long-range interactions. And I'm interested in looking at that from an MCTDH-X perspective. I'm also interested in the physics of rotating BCs and how they behave under stirring processes and anisotropies in the one-body potentials and so on. I'm looking also at quasicrystal dynamics. And then a very big part that was throughout my PhD and first postdocs was to look at cavity BEC systems. And I want to give you kind of like a brief kind of explanation or tiny presentation about those 4 topics separately. So dipolar quantum simulators. What is a quantum simulator? So a quantum simulator is a quantum system that recreates another quantum system that is harder to probe. So imagine that you want to look at high temperature superconductivity. You cannot really do it directly by probing the cuprates, for instance, because there is disorder and it's hard to probe inside the system to understand the microscopic pairing mechanisms. But it's also very hard to do it computationally because the Hilbert space scales exponentially. You can only do very tiny system sizes, so that does not give you information about the thermodynamic limit. So sometimes I say it's a lab within a lab because you use a lab to recreate another lab that you use to simulate quantum systems. So like I said, high temperature superconductivity is an example. We can ask, what is the theory that correctly describes high temperature superconductivity? Some toy models that are used are Hubbard models or TJ models or some variations of those. But the problem is that it's either hard to probe the target system directly, but it's also hard to computationally solve these Hamiltonians for very large system sizes. So instead, what you can do is to use ultra-cold atoms in optical lattices to simulate this type of lattice model, but in much larger scale, and then try to get information about the microscopics from that larger scale. So nowadays, there is actually in the past 10 years already, where we started doing experiments with dipolar molecules such as sodium cesium. And now they've reached a point that they can be controlled so well in experiments that they can induce Bose-Einstein condensation of dipolar molecules. And those dipolar molecules, because they're dipoles, they have long-range interactions. So for now they're dipolar, so they're not as long range as Coulomb, but then the goal is to come closer to something that is more Coulomb-like, and then really simulate the strong interactions that appear in these materials. So the ingredients to get those dipolar quantum simulators are the molecules themselves, and then some optical lattice. And this is in the continuum. This is a continuum description. If you load those dipolar molecules in the optical lattices and you cool them down to their ground state, you go from this continuum system to an approximation of the lattice model that you want. And this is the quantum simulation principle that I talked about. But then a question that is important to answer, since they have not really recreated the systems yet, is to understand theoretically a priori how reliable those quantum simulators are. And this is what we did with MCTDH-X. It's contained in this study and also a new paper that is coming out soon in Physical Review Research. So what we did is really compared the continuum system described by MCTDH-X with the target lattice model that we can solve with exact diagonalization to see whether they agree with one another. So here from the continuum, we can get, from the decomposition we learned today, we can get orbitals and coefficients, and then we can get observables like the ground state energy, or we can get the many-body wave function directly, that we can then compare by projecting it into the lattice space, subspace of the system. We can compare it directly by calculating overlaps between the continuum wave function and the lattice wave function. And that gives us a quantitative information of how well the two descriptions agree with one another.
In the box, how about in the discrete one, do you use a single band approximation or?
That's the whole point, that we first looked at the single band, then we saw that there were certain discrepancies. If you add more bands, then you can agree more in the result. And that is telling you that the quantum simulator is recreating not the single band lattice model, but the multi-band lattice model.
But you didn't have any fitting parameters. One could imagine that you add some fitting parameters to single band. Like we know that.
What do you mean by fitting parameter?
The linear functions, now you maybe use the linear function to calculate overlap integrals.
Yes.
But the linear functions in the interacting case, you can still have linear functions, orbitals looking like linear functions, but they are broader.
Yes.
You can have the width as a fitting parameter.
Yeah, in principle, you can also add that. Yeah.
And then maybe one could still have a single band model that gets a bit better.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yes. That's the stuff that we were saying before, that the Vannier functions are typically calculated only from the one body potential, but if you add interactions, then they get deformed by that. Now here we were only calculating them from the finite lattice, so it was not we were taking into account the finiteness of the lattice, but still they were only from the lattice and not from the interactions.
Your many-body wave function in the left side and the right side have different bases. Then you do the overlaps.
Yeah, no, you have to project into one another. So you can either take that one and project into the basis of the lattice model, or you do the.
You have a continuous model and you have a discretized system.
Yeah, here you need to construct continuous wave functions. So you need to use the Vannier function. That's what it was saying. So you do the exact diagonalization, and then for each occupied or non-occupied state, you consider the Vannier function of that state, and then you multiply the Vannier function with the coefficients of the ED, and then you get basically a continuum representation of the lattice. Then you're in the same. If you use a number of Vannier functions that is the same as the number of orbitals, then you have the same dimensionality.
I know you have the same dimensionality, but the basis is still different.
So you still have, so this basis is the basis of Vannier functions.
Yes.
This is the basis of the optimized orbitals that you get.
Yes.
But in the end, you can still have a description of, so there will be two different sets.
There's nothing to stop here. Check if the device is on your home Wi-Fi network.
Okay, Siri going insane. So you will have different, so the basis set will be different, but then the Hilbert space will be the same. So it's just two different bases, or which are rotated with respect to one another, two different descriptions of the same Hilbert space, because you project it down to from the lattice to the continuum.
But the orbitals of the many-body wave function have different information. When you just different bases, then I don't expect these are very good overlaps between them.
No, they're actually excellent. In the regimes where you expect them to agree, then It's just like a different basis, like a rotated. This is like an infinite dimensional basis because you have functions, right? So you can always find a unitary transformation to map the two.
What do you, like, if you don't have dipole interaction, I know that if you ramp up the interaction, the lowest orbitals for the ground state will not be S. Whatever you can get to P, or they are lower. Could you see something like that when you have some dipole interaction?
I don't know how you would calculate the difference between S and P in MCTDH-X. Ah, I see. Okay. Yeah. I mean, you can get that by just looking at the orbitals and how they are shaped. But there's still that question that the optimization is done in this kind of self-consistent way. They will not necessarily look like linear functions.
Okay.
They might be more localized. They might look like something else.
Because I remember this by Ophir in 2006 or something.
Yeah.
And they did similar to this, but without dipole interaction.
Mm-hmm.
And then they saw that when they ramp up the interaction, the ground state are actually more P-like.
Yeah. Yeah, the information is there. It's contained there, so you can extract it. Yeah.
What is the motivation for looking at dipolar, point charge?
It comes from the experiments, like I said. So there is now many groups in Innsbruck. There is Francesca Ferlaino. There is Sebastian Will in Colombia. They're all dealing with these magnetic atoms or dipolar molecules, and they're able to control them with like very high precision now. So the next thing that one would expect is to use them, to place them in optical lattices and then use them as dipolar quantum simulators. So then we want to see whether they would be precise enough and they would lead to an inherently different physics because of the long range interactions. So you could use those molecules to recreate lattice models with long range interactions that you could not do if you only have contact interactions. Then you would only get the usual Hubbard model with the U term.
Okay, but you gave this example of high temperature superconductivity. It's not like you think it can help in understanding that.
I don't know. I mean, electrons are Coulomb interacting fundamentally, right? There is screening and everything, so that's kind of renormalized. But if you think about surfaces or like 2D films or something that is lower dimensional, then the screening is less effective and you have the more the long range part of the interactions.
Mm.
So that could be useful.
I thought that actually molecules they haven't gone so far, but they are more with like atoms, with Rydberg atoms.
That is also another, yeah.
They have gone further there in experimentals.
Yeah, they have more control with Rydberg atoms as well. Yeah, but I think the Rydberg atom community is more focused on quantum computation rather than quantum simulation.
Okay.
They just want to use the atoms as qubits and then encode information. Whereas in the experiments in these groups in Innsbruck and Colombia, I think they're really more focused on the fundamental physics, trying really to control this condensates and then manipulate them in some way. And I think then it's probably easier to just put them in lattices and see what's happening.
What are Rydberg atoms?
So Rydberg atoms are atoms whose electrons are excited to very high quantum number n. So because they are very far away from the nucleus, they kind of feel it's kind of having like a dipole, like a negative charge and a positive charge. So they behave like dipoles. And they interact with van der Waals forces with one another, which then you can approximate as long range.
But how do they stay excited during the whole experiment?
I don't know. I think they just use pulses.
The lifetime of these highly excited
it's quite high.
Seconds or it can be very long.
Okay, so they stay excited for the relevant.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know if then they re-excite them constantly with lasers. So I don't know how they control. Because like I said, they also use them for quantum information processing. And there is like many companies that, try to come up with them. But I don't know the technicalities of how they keep them, their state. And
they have to do the experiment fast.
Yeah. Okay, so we discussed this. So these are a couple of results in 1D. So this V is the strength of the interparticle interaction. And then the different colors correspond to different system sizes. So different number of particles and different depth of the potential. This is the energy difference, and this is the fidelity. And this is for one band. And for 4 and 5 particles in, I think, 9 lattice sites. And you see the comparison between the density in the continuum in blue and density in the lattice model in red, in the right-hand side graphs. So you see that the energy difference is quite low. The fidelity remains quite high, even to long, strong interactions. And then also from the density point of view, they look kind of the same. And this is for 4 and 5 particles. So until you have kind of low filling, things are kind of looking okay. But then if you add just one more particle, the situation changes completely. You see that even from the density perspective, you see that there is not just quantitative, but qualitative changes between the blue and the red. You see peaks in different places. So basically the lattice model at the one band level and the continuum model are kind of predicting different distributions of particles. And you can also see it in the fidelity, which really drops quite considerably.
Do you have any clue why just one particle made such a big difference?
I'm not sure, because you're going from 5 to 6, and 5 is already above half filling.
Yeah.
So it might just be that, you know, there is a certain threshold, you just put enough particles and then they just interact too strongly with one another, and then they have to occupy higher bands. And that threshold for this geometry happens to be at 6. It's 2/3 of the occupation. So I don't know if that 2/3 is really universal, or it depends on the number of particles and so on. But I would also have expected something at half filling, but then it's actually a bit higher. Yeah. So you see here, there is another set of curves, the blue ones. Those correspond to the 2-band comparison, where you have 2 bands for the lattice and 2 bands, so we have 9 sites. So we have 2 bands for the lattice, that is 18 Wannier functions. So we use 18 orbitals in the MCTDH-X calculations correspondingly. And you see that the fidelity improves quite dramatically. So that is telling you that at strong interactions, or even intermediate interactions, really, if you have enough or high enough filling, what is happening in the quantum simulator is that you're pushing the particles to higher bands. And that's why the 2-band calculation has a higher fidelity and the 1 band is lower. Yeah.
Have you tried this with 9 particles in 9 holes?
No, because then you have, the scaling is really bad, because the scaling is, you can calculate the number of configuration, right? The scaling would be 9 plus, if you just do 1 band, it would be 9 plus 9 minus 1, choose 9. So this is 17, choose 9, which is kind of already a large number. If you use 18 bands, or sorry, 18 2 bands, so 18 orbitals, then you get something really, really huge.
What happens with a single band?
With a single band, like fulfilling, you mean? Yeah, no, I don't think we need to check that.
Because if you look at the picture with the 5 particles and 9 sides, they just also fit really well in there. Because you can have a side filled, a side empty, a side filled, a side empty.
I mean, it's not really that simple, because your optical lattice is not very, very rigid, right? So you can still deviate a bit away from the bottom of the lattice site. And that's what's really happening. You know, there is too much repulsion from the particles, so then they prefer to just sit slightly away from the bottom of the lattice site instead of being precisely at the lattice site. So it's a competition between the one body potential and the 2 body interaction.
Right. It's fulfilling the no interaction limit.
Why no interaction? No.
I just ask you.
No. I mean, there's still interactions, right? These are bosons. So, and they're repulsive. So it would be kind of like a Mott insulating limit.
Yeah, I just sort of wondered intuitively if you could get the fidelity back up.
Yeah.
For fulfilling.
Yeah, potentially. I don't know. I haven't checked.
You can run it later, actually, right?
Yeah, exactly. If you want, you can check.
Have you, if you have half filling, have you checked like super solid or short density waves?
So this was 9 sites, so it wasn't really
Yeah.
possible to do half filling, but in principle you can do with 8 or something, and then you can check. So because you have for super solid, you need to have a continuous symmetry that you break, right?
Yeah, then you would populate every second site or something, or the density will be.
Oh, like a charge density wave.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, the super solid would be for the superfluid and charge density.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think it already shows something like that for 5 particles, if I'm not mistaken. It's some type of charge density wave configuration, right? Oh, no, I went too far.
Because that's something that early on with dipolar Hubbard models, that was one of the things with those models that we have these new phases.
Yeah, yeah, this is the charge density wave
Yeah.
configuration.
Yeah, that's-
Okay, we also did this type of simulations also in 2D. This was 1D. In 2D, we get very similar results. Here because to look at structure, you need at least 3 times 3 sites. So we already have 9 sites. It's a bit hard to go to the full 2 bands description. You would need 36 orbitals, 36 bands, which is really huge. So what we did instead, we did what we call the 1.5 band calculation, where you consider 2 bands in one direction and 1 band in the other direction. That is still computationally manageable. And then we compared the continuum and the lattice calculations across the single band and the 1.5 band picture. And we see again the same kind of message that strong interactions and high filling leads to a dramatic decrease in the fidelity that corresponds to a different behavior in the density as well. So, and here you even have different orderings. So you have something that looks more like a checkerboard pattern for the single band picture. Then if you include more bands, the system prefers to go into a striped configuration, which is like this kind of like 3 and 3 and nothing in the middle. So we see here that dipolar interactions do not only induce qualitative changes, but also might also induce changes in phases. So get new types of phases that are stabilized by this type of long-range interactions. And with that, we are able to construct some type of maps of how accurate the dipolar quantum simulators are with respect to the typical experimental parameters that they use, such as filling fraction, the depth of the optical lattice, and the interaction strength. Okay, let me go a bit faster because it's already quite late. So another kind of field or topic that people working with MCTDH-X are interested in is rotating BCs. So BCs, we've mentioned it today many times, it means Bose-Einstein condensates, the so-called fifth state of matter, where a macroscopic number of particles condense into the same quantum state. And it has interesting properties such as superfluidity, vortices, solitons, and so on. And BCs are nowadays like an fundamentally important experimental tool that is used to generate other phases, like happening with cavity modes or looking at supersolidity and so on. Yeah. Why rotating BCs? So why are we interested in modeling rotating BCs? Well, the first answer is because we can. So why not? You want to look at the behavior of like a dynamic spinning system. This is also very much related to the creation of vortices, because you introduce already a vorticity through the rotation, so you can see how vortex that are inherent in the BEC responds to that. Because you have superfluidity, then you have dissipationless flow that would lead then to long-lived currents into the BECs, and also kind of like vortex nucleation and so on. And so the BCs, the rotating BCs are well studied with mean field theories like Rospitayevsky, but not so much at the many-body level. And so MCTDH-X could offer you more insights into the correlations and how the fragmentation of this condensates happens during the rotation. So here I show you a recent study that was done by Snehana Datta and Ophir Alon in Haifa. Here, what they do, they look at some 2D rotation of a BC with some Gaussian interactions. And then what they see is that if they have traps that are anisotropic, depending on the symmetry of the trap, if it's like twofold, threefold, fourfold symmetric, they can get, as a function of the rotation strength, they can get fragmentation that is compatible with the underlying symmetry. So you get either two blobs or like a triangle or like a square of blobs. So you can get the separation. And interestingly, you would expect them to be equally populated, but actually there is still some superfluid that is retained. And you can see it here in these plots. I'm sorry, they're a bit small. So this is the natural occupation of the orbitals. And you see that here, they're both kind of equally occupied as you increase the rotation. But here in the 3 and the 4, there is still one dominant one, and then the other ones are kind of smaller. So here you see that you still retain a lot of superfluidity. There is one core orbital that is occupied, and then there is some corrections, even though they're kind of fully, separated in the density. So there's still a lot of correlation between those 4 peaks. And it's, I think, something quite unexpected that you still retain so much superfluidity, even though you kind of like putting them apart.
What would be the light spots? They are not vortices, they are the densities.
This is the density, yeah.
And
So it's the density as you increase the rotation strength.
okay, so first you had a vortex in the middle one.
Yes, so first you have just a blob, like superfluid, then you create a vortex, but then the vortex becomes so large that it just breaks the condensate
And why
apart.
don't you get like a precursor of lattice of vortices like in the picture you had on the previous slide? Like why do you get the large high excited?
I think this is probably because the number of particles was not large enough.
Yeah, okay.
This is more like a intermediate size system.
Yeah.
I think they were using either 100 or 1,000 particles. It might also be that the recursive lattice appears in the intermediate regime of the rotation. So here the rotation is so strong that it just pulls them apart. But despite that, they still retain some type of superfluidity, if you can call it that, in the sense that there is one macroscopic occupied orbital, and then there's some correction to it.
How is that symmetry broken? Because it's still, the entire problem is four-fold symmetric, for example. But one of the 4 sides is occupied with half the particles.
But no, I mean, the orbitals don't have to look like localized particles, right? The orbitals, I don't know how they look like because I don't have data, but the orbitals could be something that is still symmetric.
Okay, good. Great.
But there is one that is, I don't know, maybe it's like something that looks like this, like the 4-1 that is mostly occupied. And then there is some corrections that are still symmetric in some way.
But it's still some kind of symmetry breaking going on.
But I think, yeah.
Because it peaks more, it's not symmetric. The density is not symmetric, I guess it's a symmetry break.
Well, the density is consistent with the symmetry. This is a 4-fold symmetric trap.
Yeah. So this is, yeah.
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 But I don't know how the orbitals look like, so I don't want to say things about whether they're symmetric or not. Yeah, the impressive things or a surprising thing is that you still maintain so much superfluidity after just breaking them apart. No, now I'm going backwards.
So what you contain superfluid, so one could imagine that now you actually have 4 pieces, but that's not what it means here. It means that you have coherence.
You have still a lot of coherence, yeah. I think also like my natural idea was that you would get 4 separate PCs that just split up, but actually they're separated in the density, but they're still highly correlated and there's still tunneling processes possible. I think we can skip that.
Can you see currents in this rotating BC? Because what I was thinking when you were thinking of the correlation between the various pools in which the superfluid condensates, quote unquote. I was wondering if it is the superfluid fraction that is like forming a current connecting those pools, and it is the one responsible for the
So
polarization.
for me, when you say current, I always imagine something that is time dependent. So that is a function of time, right? Those, I think, were all ground states solutions of the system. So there is no time dependence in place. But what you could do is you could do a time evolution where you do the rotation in time, you increase it, linearly or something. And then you see how the condensate breaks apart. And then you can map out how the correlation behave as a function of time. And then maybe you would see an influx of probability or correlation in one direction or another. That's something you could do. Okay, another kind of direction that I've been going through or towards in the past year is that of quasicrystals. So that combines kind of like elements of optical lattice with disorder. So quasicrystals are long-range ordered but non-periodic structures. They were first discovered in chemistry. Actually, they were the reason why one of the Nobel Prizes in chemistry was awarded in 1982. And they are interesting because, well, first of all, they're a new crystallographic paradigm. They were not known before. They kind of break our conventional wisdom of how crystal form. And also they have an interesting mathematical description where there is no translational symmetry. So you can get new band theory and new descriptions. And it's also connected with disorder and many-body localization from like a fundamental perspective. And you can get it when you have certain rotational symmetries that are 5-fold or 8-fold, or like the ones that you don't usually see in crystals, like 3, 4, 4-fold, and so on. In ultracoatomic labs, they can also be engineered by combining, specifically in 2D, by combining different lasers. In 1D, you just use incommensurate optical lattices. In 2D, you use this kind of 5-fold or 8-fold symmetric lasers. The easiest one is to use 8-fold symmetric because you can just use 4 and 4 and then counter propagating beams. That's what they do in Cambridge in the lab of Ulrich Schneider, for instance. And you can really see this pattern in the Bragg diffraction, where you have this kind of like 8-fold symmetry, and then you have a non-periodic but long-range ordered structure that appears. So what I did was to look at 1D quasicrystals and to look at how what's something called the single particle mobility edge is affected by having long-range interactions, in this case, dipolar interactions. So the single particle mobility edge is just a fancy word that means that there is a coexistence of localized and extended states in the same spectrum. And it's kind of like similar to Anderson localization, but that only happens in 3D, but for just 1D systems. So you can kind of obtain the same type of behavior in a 1D geometry. So the protocol that they use in the experiments to kind of understand this phenomena is to start with a charge density wave profile. So you populate one side, not the next, and another one, yes and no. And then you quench it to the quasi-periodic potential. So you quench it at time 0, you just add it suddenly. And then you see how the density behaves in time. So it can either stay mostly in the same space. In that case, you can guess that most of the eigenstates are localized, or actually all of the eigenstates are localized, so they just remain there. At the other extreme, you have the states just kind of moving away because they are extended, so you lose this information about the initial state. And then, interestingly, there is this intermediate phase where you have this mobility edge that separates the localized to the extended states. And there are several quantities that you can use to kind of measure this behavior. One is the imbalance between the odd and the even lattice size that you populate at the beginning. And the other one is the global size of the atomic cloud. So it's something called the expansion, to see how basically how much the condensate or the particles expand in time.
And it's the quench that decides if it will be above or below the mobility edge.
Yes, so you quench to a given Hamiltonian with a given height of the potential and a given disorder strength.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
it's hard to know if you, what will your energy be, but then I guess you can change the head. Like, you want to have you want to control the energy of your initial state. But what you control is actually the quenched Hamiltonian.
No, and so in the protocol, the initial state is always the same.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but the initial state could be some ground state of the unquenched Hamiltonian, and then you quench it.
yes,
And
yeah,
then you would like that you either end up above or below the mobility edge.
yes.
But that they, I guess, controlled by changing some parameter like.
Yes, so what you do so maybe I had it in the previous slide. Yeah, so in 1D you have this primary lattice, which is just a regular lattice,
Yeah.
cosinusoidal. And then you have a perturbation, which is VD, which is another lattice with a different incommensurate period. That where VD is typically a bit smaller than VP. It's like, let's say if VP is between 3 and 8, then VD is like between 0 and 2 or something like that. It's maybe one order of magnitude smaller, but it's still a sensible perturbation. And what that implies is that you will get, and this doesn't work, right? So let's choose the green one. You will get a potential that looks something like this, right? Where you still have the regular pattern of the cosine, but then you have this kind of like, the minima are always shifted, and they are shifted in a non-periodic way. And the non-periodicity comes because you have incommensurate frequencies. Yeah, so you have these two measures to recreate and measure and track the experimental protocol. And this is exactly what I did in MCTDH-X. So I recreated the same experimental protocol. This is the experimental data that they recreated. And this is the data that you can get from MCTDH-X. So you can see that you have all the main phases. So this actually goes to much wider ranges. So it will go all the way here. So that's why you just need to consider this part, this square, to compare it directly with the experiment. And you see that you have the 3 different phases. So you have the localized. This should be a video. Yeah, you see that it starts there and then it stays there throughout the time evolution. It doesn't move. Then you have at the other extreme the extended phase, where you start from this pattern and then you quickly kind of expand away. So you lose all your initial information. And then there is this situation in between, in the intermediate phase, where you, the video didn't play. Where you have kind of like a bit of both, right? So you still expand slightly, but most of it stays concentrated in the beginning and also has the same charge density wave information from the beginning. This is a signal that you have both extended and localized states.
What did you do to calculate for different phases?
These 2 observables that I mentioned at the beginning, the imbalance and the expansion, which are derived by the density, basically.
And what would happen if you simulated it with CrossFit?
I mean, those are fermions, so you cannot really,
Fermions.
those are fermions, so you cannot really use Cross-Pitayevsky. You could use a Hartree-Fock,
Yeah.
but I don't know. I always used at least n+2 orbitals for my sim, so I was always beyond Hartree-Fock just to be safe.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this was actually the non-interacting part, so you don't even need to use those methods. But then what I looked into was what is the difference if you add dipolar interactions? So what is the change? Does it change anything in the phase diagram? And it turns out that dipolar interactions, in this case, forget about the attractive, because in the end I didn't really put them in the paper, but the repulsive ones, they seem to stabilize the intermediate phase. It becomes larger and larger. And this is because, it's a bit complicated to explain at length, but essentially it's because there is interference that occurs in the long-range tails of the interactions that cause particles to localize more easily. And that's why you also see this bubble of localized states that appear out of nowhere, seemingly out of nowhere, right? Where they used to be just a bit extended and maybe a bit intermediate, but now there is a huge cluster of just very localized states. And those really come from the interference patterns from the dipolar interactions. Okay, and finally, a couple of words on the cavity BEC systems. This is what most people have worked on in the past 5 to 10 years. So the idea is, we already talked about BECs and what they are and what they can be useful for. Here, this is another instance of why they can be useful. If you put a BEC in a cavity and shine light onto it, you can get new states of matter that kind of combine both the atomic and the light degree of freedom. You can get superradiant phase transitions, you can get self-organization, you can map the superfluid to multi-insulating phase transition in this self-organized regime. And you can also get very long range up to infinite range interactions if you consider what I said at the beginning and the other presentation, where the lights can scatter in the cavity and can go back and forth many times, and they can mediate very long range interaction between different atoms. Yeah, and there's many more things that one can do. And all of these setups can be handled with MCTDH-X, thanks to this cavity module that we have. So this is the Hamiltonian that we're actually coding. I just want to give you an overview of what we are actually inserting into the equations of motion. So this is in the rotating frame of the cavity. There is a part that is just the atomic degrees of freedom that are weakly interacting. There's the kinetic part, the on-site interaction part, and then there is a trapping. Typically, we use the harmonic traps to confine them. Then there is the interaction with the cavity. The cavity is given by this operator A. So there is the cavity, so the atoms induce an energy shift into the cavity modes. But you can also drive the cavity, populate the cavity with the atoms due to the scattering. And also there is the pure cavity part on itself. And all of these quantities in principle can be also time dependent. So you can have a time varying laser field that you can shine on the atoms, and then you can change over time. So the equations of motion that you solve, in the end, you have the usual UMs for the atomic degrees of freedom, but then additionally on top of that, what MCTDH-X is doing behind the curtains is having another equation of motion for the cavity mode. And typically we treat that semi-classically, so we consider that as just a complex number. But then you can integrate that out and then insert that as an effective long-range, infinite-range interaction in the atoms. And then you can keep kind of the full quantumness of the cavity if you want.
Well, no, I would say that when you have done mean there and it's integrated, if you had full quantum, then you would get some noise terms in your.
Some what terms?
So you have dissipation already there when you do mean field on the cavity field, neglect fluctuation from the environment. And if you plug, if you integrate out this, that will not be taken care of in your atomic part.
No, I think you can still get information about the cavity fluctuations because those are encoded into the atomic interactions.
No, but you have then it would be strange because you do one approximation. And
this is the adiabatic limit, what I'm talking about.
Yeah, but so already in your, maybe we should not.
Yeah, maybe you can discuss later, but yeah, it's already a bit late. But yeah, I just wanted to show you that people are working on this. We were able to map out the phase transitions that occur. For instance, if you increase the laser pump, you can go from the BEC kind of state, the usual Thomas Fermi shape, to something that self-organizes because of the interaction with the photons. The photons kind of create an effective optical lattice that the atoms want to kind of minimize. And then so they acquire this kind of self-organized profile. And then this is effectively a transition from a superfluid to a Mott insulating state. And we can track it with MCTDH-X, and we can also track correlations and so on. We can also look at different regimes. So this was the red detune regime. If you go to the blue detune regime, you get other types of behavior. You get kind of these hierarchical superfluids, and you can also go to like chaotic regimes, signaled by limit cycles and so on. We also did it for the 2D setup. That was like a full comparison between the experimental results in the hemorrhage lab and our simulations. And we were able to really kind of precisely map this Mott insulating phase transition. And then what we also did was to drive the system periodically in time and then see a super lattice switching between those two configurations that can appear. So I said there is this self-organization. This is a Z2 symmetry breaking because you can either self-organize in what we call the odd lattice or the even lattice. So there is two different. You can imagine, something like this. This is one lattice, and the other lattice is just shifted by one place. And then, in principle, you do not know which one you can occupy. But if you drive the system periodically in time, what you see is that you periodically shift between one or the other. So you see here the peak is in the middle, and the peaks here are like at the even lattice sites. Then it goes back to the middle, and so on. So we can get this kind of like interesting superlattice switching features. And this was a cool video that we made that shows kind of that dynamically in time, how it goes. This is actually the one body density, the one body reduced density matrix, but it's basically the same information about the density. And you see that it goes, from the centered to the kind of like 4 peaks, symmetric 4 peaks. So one last minute to tell you what we plan to do next and what you could join if you're interested. So there is a short-term to long-term axis in terms of time, and then there is a low complexity to a high complexity axis. So what we were looking at now is kind of stalled a bit. We were looking at short-term and low complexity at just reusing this machinery that we already have with periodicity, so time periodicity, and also combine it with machine learning to look at how to control the flow population in double wells. Then we mentioned quasi-crystals. There is also the possibility of going to 2D to really mimic the experiments that they're doing in Cambridge. The other axis is to look at multi-component particles, bosons and fermions. This is very relevant for some other experiments that they're doing in EPFL and the group of Jean-Philippe Rantut with fermions and cavities. We can also do it in 1D without the multi-component part. That's slightly easier to do. Also in 2D. And then there is more kind of ambitious things that we want to have a go at, including some entanglement entropy measures or potentially quantum measurement back action in the cavity regime. And then for me, it would be very nice to obtain a parametrization of the Lindblad master equation we use in the MCTDH formalism. But that's something that one needs to think carefully about, because then you need to extend the expansion from the many body wave function to the density matrix. And I really don't know exactly how that will work out. But I guess in principle, one could think of something similar. And that's it. So if you want to collaborate with me, just let me know and I'm happy to help. And yeah, we'll continue in the afternoon with the hands-on session. Thanks.